myself, Richard Rachman. So who am I? I'm a graduate student here at Cal State Northridge. I'm also the Institute for Sustainability Biodiversity Coordinator. So with that, I'm gonna give folks like another minute or two to join, and then we'll like get right into it. Okay, I can start. Cool. Okay. So on today's webinar, What Goes Bump in the Night at Csun, we are going to, the way that I split this up was we're going to go through the introduction, and that's kind of like, what is this data collection, and some definitions we'll be explaining. I'm going to go into the methods of how I did what I did. Then I'm going to do the results of what I found out about utilizing the methods. I'm going to do a discussion, kind of summarizing a lot of what I found as much as I could. And then conclusions, some of my closing thoughts and advice I might have based on what I did. So what you're seeing right here is approximately the scientific method, right? You're seeing how science is communicated with people in the form of peer-reviewed literature. In this case, not quite such, but we're going to do kind of show you that backbone in this webinar. Okay, so first I'm going to do the introduction. We're going to talk about some definitions, some things to give some context to this talk today. So I'm going to be talking about nocturnal organisms. These are organisms with the highest level of activity occurring in the dark phase. And an example of this could be barn owls, right? They're nocturnal predators primarily. Then crepuscular, they have the highest level of activity occurring during the twilight or dim light phase. An example of this is like feral cats. They're really active at like sunrise and sunset. Also nocturnal, so it kind of bleeds in. Some of these definitions bleed into each other. And then diurnal, which would be the highest activity occurring during the light phase. And a good example of this is like western honeybees. So I'm also going to be talking about invasive species. I get this question a lot. What's an invasive, right? And I identify invasive species as organisms, things like animals, plants, fungi that were introduced by humans directly or indirectly into a new location and have an impact on other organisms' habitat in that new location. Kind of confusing, and there's a lot of different definitions of what makes a non-native animal, a native animal, like, or native organism, like something that belongs in that location and evolved in that location. And an invasive species, this is the definition I'm going to use for invasive species, and I kind of include non-native into that. Though I do understand that in the large biological community, there may be some more nuance between non-native and invasives. And another concept I'm going to talk about today is light pollution. And that is all of the man-made light together in a city, in cities and other human inhabited areas, typically caused by artificial electric lights. So if you think of like the glow of a city from like when you're looking out at a cliffside, all that glow, and you might not think of it as pollution, but it could be to the nocturnal animals. It could be disrupting their natural cycles. One of the last things I'm going to be talking about is going to be community science, and that's the use of internet, social media, and electronic technology to connect volunteers of all different backgrounds to scientists and natural historians in order to record organisms and ecological interactions. And some aspects of community science might be things like iNaturalist, eBird, CalFlora, and again, I'll talk a little more about that in a bit. So why did I do this, right? I was just talking to Sarah about how cool it is that I started back with the Institute this summer doing a webinar looking at biodiversity at the Csun Food Garden. And I'll talk about that space, but we wanted to see how many organisms were at the food garden. And so utilizing apps like iNaturalist and various things like Bug Guide and stuff, we found potential species of interest of about 281 species, right? And that's about how many species of plants and animals, planted, non-planted, invasive, non-invasive, native organisms we found at the food garden. It's not a very big space, right? And it's about 281 species. That's what we saw and what we predict to be there. And it's probably much bigger than that, the actual number. And that's about one species per 7 square meters, one tiny, tiny home. But when I did that, I was only capturing what I saw in the daytime, right? And looking at those definitions I talked about, there's a lot of nocturnal organisms that I probably wasn't capturing, right? What about at night? I can't be there all the time. And most of what I was observing during those 2 days that I found so many species was in the daytime. What about at night? What's happening at night at Csun? Another reason I wanted to do this and look at what happened at Csun is because of stigma against nocturnal organisms, right? I'm having this webinar about nocturnal animals and ecological interactions during Halloween because they freak people out. Like, you look at this image of a rotting tomato with Argentine ants covering it, and you're like, that's gross. What you're seeing is ecological processes at work. And sure, Argentine ants are an invasive species, but this is life, and spiders aren't as really spooky as we make them out to be. Most spiders are harmless and good for the environment. So the other thing I wanted to talk about was just awareness, right? So we have a lot of ecological disasters occurring right now. We have man-made climate change. We have the loss of a ton of biodiversity all around the world. And as the human population increases and we lose biodiversity all across the world because of urbanization, we risk losing certain animals and endangered species and such. So urban environments could be a refugia, like as a place where animals and plants can still survive if we make the habitat suitable for them, if we give them a home to live in. This is a monarch butterfly larva that I found at the Csun food garden. I shown it under black light, right? But, this is a milkweed plant, probably a tropical milkweed, but that's close by, that's covered in Argentine ants. The monarch butterfly would eat this milkweed, right? This is probably a non-native milkweed, but these Argentine ants also like farming aphids off of those milkweed plants, and they eat the milk, the honeydew off of the aphids, right? But the ants will then go attack a monarch butterfly. So we're potentially losing those pollinator species because of these ecological interactions of these invasive species, right? So it's important to monitor them, and even as volunteers and as community members, that we be aware that these things are happening, that we're losing monarch butterflies even in our own backyards. So how are we going to study the things that go bump in the night? How can you record that which you cannot see is my central question. So how are we going to do this, right? So I did this in a few different ways, okay? And we're going to break that down into methods. I'm going to talk about where we did this, when, the utilization of trail cams and what those are, utilization of black lights and what those are, and then bat recording equipment, right? Who doesn't love bats? So first, let's talk about the when and the where. So about for 2 weekends in September, I studied ecological interactions at night at the Csun Food Garden. It's a half-acre space on the Csun campus. Oh my gosh, my cardinal direction is really bad. It's south, I think, south of the Csun dorms, and a little inward from Zelza. So it's a small garden, but it has a huge amount of biodiversity in it, just because we're producing tons of fruits and vegetables, a lot of which we donate to students that are food insecure, like with the food pantry, and then also to homeless folks too, right? So not only are we helping our community, but we're helping urban biodiversity as well, right? Oh, and by the way, that last, this is a bull jumping spider, really cool. The previous spider I showed in the webinar, that's a spotted orb weaver, most likely. So that's when and where. So how did I do it, right? So I utilized trail cams, and trail cams work by anything at night, most don't utilize flash, or at least these didn't. So if it walked in front of the trail camera, the infrared signal would be triggered and it would take a picture, right, in black and white. And so I used a little bit of peanut butter and tuna, like spread around the trail cams, just to attract the sort of mammals that I knew I was interested in. And I used bungee cord to attach these trail cameras to trees in the food garden. So for the black lights, what we did was for some of the handheld black lights, we wanted to go see ecological interactions. We just walk around the food garden holding the black lights. A lot of them we set up on a blanket, and this blanket was overdrawn like a wire cage. And then animals that are attracted to the black light, they'll go on the blanket so then I could then take pictures of them, right? And so black lights, they're typically less than, the wavelength that they show off is typically less than 400 nanometers. What does that mean, right? And I think I have so this is the visual light spectrum, right? So what humans can see is actually a really small fraction of the light spectrum. And we call it the visible light spectrum, right? So it goes from about 400 nanometers to about over 700 nanometers. And then past that, you're in infrared. And before that, you're in the UV spectrum, the ultraviolet. And so what these black lights do is they utilize lights that are around less than 400 nanometers, but it's mostly visible to people as this UV light. And so it's like near ultraviolet. It's not quite ultraviolet, but we call them black lights. And you can see really cool organisms with that, like scorpions shine when you hit them with black lights, and harvestmen and certain types of spiders and a lot of poop. And we'll talk more about that. And then I utilized what's called a bat logger, and this is bat recording equipment. So bats, they emit noises for echolocation that are out of the human hearing range mostly, and they're really high pitched. So we have bat loggers and bat recording equipment. You can even download on your cell phone and stuff. But we have this sort of technology that can capture some of those high-pitched sounds. You can even identify the species of bat based on the noise they make. So I'll talk a lot more about that in a bit. Okay, so let's talk about the results. What did I find with all this cool technology, right? So I'll talk about the trail cam stuff, talk about some of my blacklight work, and then I'm going to talk about how I went bat eco, talking and looking at bats. So results with the trail cam stuff. I got a lot of images. I got thousands, probably like between like 1,000 and 2,000 images. I got a lot. And most of those images are going to be false positives. That's like when it's just like the wind moving a twig, and rats. I got quite a bit of rats, but rats are really cool, and we'll talk more about them. So some of the organisms that I caught using the trail cam, I got desert cottontails. So there's one. So this is a desert, that's the ears of the desert cottontail. Kind of hard to see, next to our California buckwheat. So that's kind of cool. I got the Virginia possum, which a lot of people are really surprised that possums aren't native to California, but they aren't. They were introduced here in the 1900s because of fur and as pets and for meat, because they reproduce really quick and they die at a young age. So they live fast and hard. Really cool, intelligent animals. And then finally, the Norway rat or brown rats are what they're called. And they don't originate from Norway. They're actually from probably Central Asia, like near Mongolia. And they traveled all around the world, mostly because of colonialism and imperialism, where a lot of the Europeans had them in Norway and stuff on the boats. And then, they would do trade and like colonize different lands and stuff. And so that spread not only a lot of the rats, but the diseases that rats have as well. But they're an invasive species that's now in North America. They have been for quite a long time. Okay, so here's the results from the blacklight. So I used a macro camera as well, a Sony A6000 mirrorless with Sony macro lens as well, to get really high definition pictures of these animals that I was attracting with the blacklight. I got about 15 insect individuals over 3 nights. And each one of those nights I sampled for 1 hour. And so I got approximately 5 morphospecies of moth. Moth are really hard to identify, and I don't pretend to be a lepidopterist. So if you have experience with lepidopterans, please, let's talk. Like if you have experience with moths and butterflies, let's try to ID some of these moths. They're really cool looking. And I got about 2 morphospecies of beetle, pretty sure they're different species. And then I got 1 wasp that came to them. So here are the beetles that I got. They look significantly different, right? Probably different species. This is the wasp that I got, and this is like really zoomed up. This wasp was super, super, super tiny. And then here's some of the images of the 5 morphospecies approximately of moth that I got. And again, some of these might be the same species, but and I got quite a bit of images of them. But again, about 15 individuals of these groups, of these 5 groups. Okay, and then for bats, I got nothing. I found that my bat logger wasn't really working. It utilized technology from Europe. I found bats and I was watching them and I had the bat logger right there with them. And I wasn't able to record any of their noise, which was really frustrating. I found about 2 to 5 individuals at the orange grove that varied depending on the night that I was surveying. And I don't really know what species they are because I wasn't able to record their noise. And you can identify bats again by the calls, the echolocation calls they make. But the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And I want to remind everyone that because it's really important. Just because I didn't get evidence of bats there, I mean, I saw them, but that doesn't mean they're not there. And bats are really important for the environment. So I'm going to discuss some of these results, right? So the trail cam data, I'm going to talk about invasive and native species and the possibility of niche partitioning, but let's be careful. I only got so much data from so many nights of tracking this. So we're going to talk about some of the moth data and ideas behind light pollution and the utilization of native plants and vegetables. And I'm going to talk about bats and community science and things like crowdfunding, bat science as a whole, and then websites like iNaturalist. Okay, so I got a lot of pictures of these rats, and I think they're kind of cute. I got some really adorable images of them, like those 2 rats that were like next to each other. In one picture, I even got 3 rats that were together. I'm guessing they were a family, a mother and children. They would dance. It was adorable. So I struggled with how am I going to synthesize trail cam data into data. So, right, I'm not a mammologist. I don't study animals, but I'm interested in them. So I kind of struggled with how am I going to show you this? So I'm going to show you this graph, and it looks kind of confusing, but this is when the animals were active, right? So I have the dates on these corners. It's the 19th, the 20th, the 28th, and the 29th. Those are the dates that I did, trail cam stuff. So, yeah. So here is a small arrow. That means that I got some activity, right? Not a lot. And it shows the species, the Norway rat. So given that color. And they were about 11 o'clock and 3 to 4 o'clock. Okay, so the next night I got more species. I got the Norway rat, the cottontail, and the possum, right? And there's this interesting gap of activity of when I didn't get any Norway rats. But, the cottontail kind of overlaps with the Norway rats. The next night I sampled, I got, from as soon as I set the trap and I left, the rats were in the area. So that was about 7 o'clock to about 10 o'clock. And then the last night I sampled, I got so many images of rats. They were just partying all night long. And then at one point, the possum came by and checked out what was going on. But there was no gap this night for the activity. So Norway rats are invasive, right? They're this really prevalent species in urban environments. There's discussion of black rats and brown rats, and they're 2 different species. I wasn't able to trap the rats, but I'm almost positive they're brown rats. So, this study could potentially benefit from trapping animals. I'm not really interested in trapping these rats for many reasons, but both are an invasive species. And we do have native rats that live within the Los Angeles basin, but in this highly urbanized area, they would most certainly be this species. Possums are probably invasive, right? That they're definitely non-native, but even a non-native animal, when it arrives into a new environment, it's utilizing resources. If anything, it has maybe a neutral effect on the area. So maybe you can make the argument that possums aren't really doing that much displacement of native species, but it's probably neutral to negative, if anything. They're also arboreal. They are strongly correlated with people, so they are in urban environments. I have seen possums in more more areas that you would call like woodland, chaparral, coastal sage scrub. And so they're probably displacing native species in those areas where they haven't been for the last, they've only been there for the last 100 years and more so even the last few decades. So, and they do live in trees, and we do have a native mesocarnivore, like a medium-sized carnivore that eats, omnivorous diet as well. The ringtail, right? And so they might be out competing the ringtail in some areas in oak woodlands and stuff. And ringtails don't really like living at all near people, except in some areas in Arizona. But in Los Angeles County, they're more so in remote areas, and it's possible possums are out competing them in those areas. So whether they're invasive or not is an interesting conversation. And the desert cottontail is native, right? And they actually love urbanization. They're known as kind of an adapter species, and I'll talk a little more about that. But all of these, desert cottontails, they eat like lawn grass and like other weeds that grow up in lawn grass and other, non-natives in the garden. And possums, they kind of eat like trash, or in this case, peanut butter and tuna, but like whatever they can kind of find. Norway rats are kind of the same, but they have like a slightly different, they live in different density numbers and they have different social structures than possums do. So they all have what they're called niches. They have different roles in the ecosystem, different places that they take in their habitats. Which leads to the possibility of something called niche partitioning, right? So I make the argument that rats and possums, they have a lot of similar food sources. So are they kind of competing for a similar space? This work that I did cannot suggest that. I didn't do extensive enough sampling. I didn't do any sort of statistical analysis. I'm just kind of inviting this possibility, right? That there could be, a possum comes by and it kind of startles the rats, so the rats go and hide, right? Are they competing for the same food sources in these urban environments, though? So, and then also, it's not just possums. In Los Angeles, we have skunks. We have 2 different species of skunk. We have the opossum, right? And then we have the raccoon as well. And they're all kind of similar sized animals. And they more or less have similar diets. Are they competing with each other? Have they come to some sort of truce where they're all kind of like happy coexisting, right? Are there areas where there's more skunks and less possums? I haven't seen any skunks on campus. I wouldn't be surprised if we have some. I've only seen possums on campus. I wouldn't be surprised if we have raccoons on campus. I haven't seen them. Perhaps this is an area where we mostly just have possums. And then rats are kind of just always out. They're always partying. If you're like, oh, well, don't worry, it's 7 o'clock. There's not going to be any rats out. Like, no, they're going to be out. Like, and if you don't see them, like, doesn't mean they're not there. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So rats are kind of always partying. And the possum and the rabbit are really interesting. And this is what I think is happening. I think what the possum does is it lives in the area, and I think it goes on these like journeys, these trails that it has. And I think it does probably the same trail every single night, where it has a path that it follows and then it leaves and does something else. And it follows its nose and like the path changes and the trail changes. I think rabbits might be the same too. I think the rabbits kind of have their, their structure, they like doing what they do, and they follow the same trail and they go do something else. And, maybe they hear an animal, so they run and their trail changes. The rats just like, I don't think they're quite as structured like that. I think they do have a routine of what they do every night, but I think a lot of it is driven by food and nest building. And they're really just trying to like pack on weight and, mate with other rats. And it's a little faster paced than a lot of the structure and routine of the possums and the rabbits. I don't know this for sure, and I'm just speculating. And a lot of this is based on stuff I've read. I'd be open to have conversation about that as well. Oh, and adapter species as well. A lot of these animals are used to living in really high stress urban environments. So things like the possums and the rabbits, like they're under constant stress. And why they do so well in urban environments is because they can handle living under such stress, right? Wood rats in the Santa Monica Mountains, same thing. A lot of them live under such strong pressure from stress. That's just how they live though. They just live under constant stress of predation. In urban environments, these animals are living under constant stress of humans and concrete substrates, and this just puts that much pressure on them, but they're used to it and they're adapted to it. So they're known as adapter species. Here's another urban animal that I wasn't able to capture on the cam, but this is a feral cat. Cats in North America are not native. Cats are native to the Middle East and to sub-Saharan Africa and stuff. And cats are responsible for about 5 billion birds in North America being killed every year. And this is a TNR cat, so TNR stands for trap, neuter, and release. And arguably, TNR still causes bird fatality, right? The goal is to get cat numbers to go down, right? I don't know if TNR is doing that. Before this webinar, trying to get the data for the Csun cat people. I wasn't able to get the data. It'd be kind of nice to eventually get that. But my thought is that students are releasing cats on campus. Those cat numbers aren't going down. There's cats in the community that are being abandoned. And TNR is just kind of contributing to the death of a lot of cats and reptiles on campus. Certainly reptiles. Alligator lizard numbers have plummeted because of the feral cats. Let's talk about moths and some of that, the results from my moth research. So 15 or so moths in 3 days of sampling. That doesn't seem like a lot of moths. I talked to one of my colleagues, Kate, about this, who's somewhat of an expert on Microlepidoptera and insects and stuff, and a really brilliant ecologist. And that doesn't seem right for September, right? Like the season's right. There's a lot of fruits and vegetables out. We're in a food garden surrounded by fruits and vegetables. It would make sense that we'd have more moths if we were doing sampling, but you're in an urban environment, so there's not a lot of suitable habitat for moths. And there's a lot of light pollution, right? So lights have been shown to decrease moth populations dramatically in Europe, and it's probably the same in urban cities and in places like Los Angeles as well. We're not a light conservation city, right? I did some field work this summer in one of the darkest places in the world in Nevada called the Massacre Range. And it was really funny because it was a bright moon and the moon lit up the sky so much. And yes, in desert ecosystems like that, the moon can have a dramatic effect on animal behavior, right? Like scorpions don't come out when there's a lot of moon. They'd be too visible to their predators, right? But in Los Angeles, the moon doesn't have as dramatic as effect. It's just always bright outside if you go out during the night. And those lights could have negative effects on pollinators and things like moths. So one idea is, just in a food garden too, is you could increase the diversity of moth by having more native plants. So typically native plants are correlated with higher insect richness and also bird richness as well, right? So if we have more native plants, could that bring more nocturnal pollinators, more moths, right? And many of these moths that I found, are they invasive species? That's possible too, right? Some of you get moth pests in your house when you leave food out and they get in there and the grubs eat a lot of your, the larvae eat a lot of your like grains and stuff. Are the species of moth that I was observing, are they just invasive species? Are they after effects of colonization into Los Angeles, right? Or are they native species? Or are these moths of concern, right? We should be conserving and creating habitat for. And how are urban lights affecting Angelino moth populations, right? Like, should we be using more sustainable methods of lighting our environment that help insect populations, right? Like some of the only insects I see buzzing around the lights at Csun are things like mantids. Commonly, I see California mantid buzzing around lights. I don't too often see moths buzzing around them. I don't know if this is because of some sort of insect apocalypse that's been theorized by some sensational people in the media, but we definitely are having a decrease in insect population in urban areas. And I think this is something that needs more study because it's important. Pollinators are really important for our food, but also for native plants as well. So, and another reason moths are really important is because they feed a lot of animals, right? Here's a simplistic food web, right? We got things like caterpillars and grasshoppers and these aphids, like eating this like sunflower, and then they feed other insects and birds and mammals, and those mammals get eaten by like mosquitoes and stuff, and you know those mosquitoes go on to die, and they pass on like parasites and stuff to other animals. So moths are part of this really complicated system. And if we're using lights at night that knock an entire group of nocturnal animals out, what effect is that having on everything else, right? So food for thought. Bats. So here's Carlos, the really cool undergrad that helps me out. He's in the Ecology and Evolution department with some of the bat recording. I also got help from another colleague, Robert, that helped me look for bats. And so I looked at Csun at the food garden. I couldn't find any there. So then I went to the duck pond, and I consistently found bats every single night, right at they're crepuscular in their activity, but they're nocturnal, right? But when I saw them was at that twilight, from that switch from day to night, consistently at the duck pond. And the duck pond's a really interesting case of like artificial food webs too. We got like ducks, and we have mosquito fish, and we have mosquitoes, and we have pond turtles, the red-eared sliders. And they're all kind of working in tandem, and then random people are feeding them bread and other terrible food sources, and their feces goes to feed the mosquito fish. And so there's like a bunch of like ecological things that are happening at the duck pond too. But there's a lot of native species too, like dragonflies that come there, or bats that utilize this duck pond. Again, I did see bats. We have bats at Csun. They're utilizing water at the duck pond. There's habitat near there. There's a lot of trees and roosting structures and like buildings in tight spaces that bats like. I had a lot of bat recording equipment. It kind of made me wish there was some sort of repository for scientific equipment that people could rent out and utilize. So what I did was I reached out to a bat researcher I know, Joey Curdy, and I was like, hey, I'm having trouble with my bat equipment. Like, where can I get bat equipment? And he was like, well, why don't you join this listserv? So it's this email list of bat researchers. And I just made a call to arms. I was like, hey, I'm this grad student that's a plant ecologist at Csun, and I want to study bats for community science. Can anyone help donate equipment or like loan me equipment? And I got a few researchers reach out to me. So there is bat equipment on the way. So we will study bats at Csun. So, and we'll find out what species they are. So the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles has this program called Backyard Bats. And I talked a bit with them, and they're really interested in community science efforts to study bats. They're really understudied in urban environments. And we just need more people that want to know more about bats and destigmatize them and get the public excited about these important, insect predators, right? So there's a lot of these scientific community science projects on Zooniverse. So Zooniverse uses community science to do these scientific projects, whether it's looking at camera trap data or, bat recordings and IDing bats. And there's also an iNaturalist bat project too that's really cool. And I'll show you some of the data from that. So there's been a bunch of citizen science bat projects in Los Angeles. Here's Dodger Stadium, right? And just outside of Dodger Stadium, we saw multiple different species of bats. So that we know there's bats here. There's Mexican freetail, Yuma myotis, western yellow bat, the silver-haired bat. So we know there's bats here, right? And there's way more bats than just this. And there's way more projects than just this. But you could be a part of that, So what about other community science efforts, right? So I started this project, Csun at Home. We currently have, I think, 34 members. Yeah, currently have 34 members. I'm doing this in tandem with the People in Ecology class. And what I want to know, and if you want to join this project, go ahead, right? So what I want to know is how are Csun students, staff, and faculty, what organisms are they seeing during the pandemic at their home? What organisms during the pandemic are they seeing on their hikes, on their like little mini vacations, right? Like what are we seeing where we live and breathe, right? So this isn't like a look at Northridge or Los Angeles. This goes from New York to Northern California. Like I'm getting observations from all over the place. And I moderate it and I make sure that people aren't posting landscaping plants, just wild wild animal plants, things that are just showing up in areas, and then they're recording that, right? Not something someone planted. We're not as interested in that. But maybe those restoration projects, those planting projects, they're reproducing, they're spreading. Or those, like, that tomato plant is now making more tomato plants, and that variety of tomatoes now spreading into wild areas. That's something that we're interested in capturing using iNaturalist. So what about this project, right? Me looking at nocturnal animals. The whole reason I did this is because I knew I was missing nocturnal animals and plants, right? Or not really plants, but so since doing this project, I now have 145 observations at the Csun food garden, right? That's 107 species that aren't planted, that aren't like tomato plants and stuff, things that just vicariously showed up there, either plants or animals. That's a lot. And I had 50 community ecologists and volunteers identify my plants and animals. So that's like 50 people that have now also looked at the Csun food garden and helped us out. That's really cool. That's community right there. And we're also on CalFlora. CalFlora is the website that how plant ecologists, like, we go to CalFlora when we're studying a group of plants that we're interested in. And I've been adding our CalFlora data, our iNaturalist data onto CalFlora and helping the botanical world grow as well. So now we have 14 records on CalFlora just from the Csun food garden. That's cool. That's really cool. I also utilized crowdfunding to do a lot of this project, right? So I want community science to be democratic. It should be for everyone. It shouldn't matter what your socioeconomic status is, right? Like, environmental racism shouldn't impact your ability to record plants and animals where you live, right? And so part of that is by talking to people and be like, look, I don't have the money to afford batteries for this project. Could you loan me, or could you give me some money for this project? And I had like some amazing donors back up this project with $85 that I was able to buy a bunch of batteries for this electronic equipment. I wanted to do this as a proof of concept that you can get help to do science, right? Like, we can involve the entire community in doing these scientific endeavors. And I think that's really important. So I talked a little bit about native plants, but why? So native plants, they increase heterogeneous animal habitat, right? So that's like different levels of animal habitat. That's like bare ground, they can, shrubs, little herbaceous plants, like tall trees. It's different levels. And that's really important for animals, that some animals only like to live in high trees. Some animals like to live in the mid small trees and bushes and little plants. Like, some animals like to live underground. So like, you need different layers of habitat, and native plants can help with that. Native plants also increase food for pollinators and birds. This is, like I said before, really important for increasing biodiversity in your garden. Californians don't know what California is, right? We have this concept of eucalyptus trees, palm trees, and orange trees. And that's not what California looks like. That's what California looks like after colonization. So if you want to get a sense of what California should look like look no further than our ancestral native plants. Get a sense for what California really is, the smells, the taste, the feel, and the native plants that bring the native animals, and sometimes the invasive animals too. And native plants bring a sense of community too, right? You have seen groups like the California Native Plant Society, you have these native plant nurseries where we're just obsessed with being outdoors and getting to know our neighbors and talking to people about plants. And that's the beauty of native plants that I want to instill into all of you too. So some conclusions, some spooky conclusions. Let's plant more native plants, right? And let's do it from local sources. I'm gonna be doing a webinar next month talking about local sources for native plants. And we still have native plants in Northridge. We still have native plants in Los Angeles. In the most urban, dense area with concrete everywhere, there's still native plants there. You just gotta look really hard. So let's find those plants in those abandoned lots. Let's collect the seeds legally and let's propagate them and put them in gardens because they attract native animals. Water features also attract more animals. So if you're looking at your garden to create habitat, not only to have fruits and vegetables, but why not think about a water feature as well? Something like a bird bath, or maybe like a permanent water source with like a water filter in there, like a little pond, right? Looking for insects and spiders is really fun. I really enjoy it. And it's really important too, because there potentially could be a link between the animal communities that you have in your area and the socioeconomic status of your neighborhood too. And we need to study this more, right? And as community scientists, we can do this. We can look at insects and plants and birds, and we can record this and we can give that data to other scientists and other volunteers. And we can start learning things about ourselves, about our history, about our neighbors. And that's really fun and important. And community science should involve everyone, right? It shouldn't matter your race or it shouldn't matter your socioeconomic status. It should be accessible to everyone. So if you don't have a cell phone, like, you should still be able to do community science. And I don't think that should be a barrier. And if it is, that's our fault. We need to do something about that to get rid of those barriers. Some of my ideas is there should be some sort of community rental service for technology to monitor plants and animals. I think libraries, biology departments should have some sort of way that community scientists and volunteers can access these sorts of monitoring devices like trail cams and blacklights and that equipment, rent them out, assume liability for them if they're broken, but to rent them out and then to use them to record plants and animals, right? And we should be doing a better job of linking experts to people, to just anyone, right? So if you like plants, hey, I'm kind of a plant expert, let's talk, right? If you like moths, I know a person. I don't know a person. I would love to know a moth person. But like, we should be connecting like scientists to community scientists and volunteers and stuff, right? If scientists aren't good at speaking to the public, that's their fault, right? And there should be accessibility at all levels of academia. Seed collecting and propagating is really important, like native plants, right? We want to spread native plants, get more of those pollinators, more of that habitat. And we should make sure that the permitting process for getting those seeds from local environments is really user-friendly. I strongly believe seeds are democratic. Like, seeds are the way that we can feed people, seeds are the way that we can spread native plants. And that process should be as easy and sustainable and user-friendly as possible. Okay, so I got a lot of acknowledgements for this. I would like to thank the Csun Institute for Sustainability, particularly Nat. Thank you so much for believing in me. I'd like to thank the Csun Biology Department. One of my colleagues, Natalie Castillo, thank you so much. Carlos Colleron, Robert, Kate, Robin, Jim, Nurit, and Mars, and Joey for your help and advice. The San Fernando Valley Audubon, CalFlora, iNaturalist Bug Guide, and CNPS. My advisor, Dr. Polly Schiffman, tearing up. Some of the donors, Matt Dixon, Julia, Alejandra, Vera, any anonymous GoFundMe donors, and of course, my partner, Gabriel. Thank you so much. Do you have any questions? It looks like we have some in the chat. Yeah, thank you so much. If maybe this will spur some questions, but I do have more pictures if y'all want to see some. Yeah, so let me show you some photography that I took. So here's I use black lights to record around the food garden. So this is on a narrow leaf milkweed, which is native, right? Actually it might be tropical milkweed now that I'm looking at it. But you see this aphid poop, right, from the Argentine ants that they're feeding off of that. So you can see that in blacklight. You can see that poop using blacklights. It's really cool. Here are those aphids, and you can see some Argentine ants that are farming them and sucking the honeydew out of their butts that the aphids are producing. And these are oleander aphids, also an invasive species like the Argentine ant. Here's I believe a brown widow that I recorded on one of the sages that we have. So, you know, they're targeting a lot of pollinators, but they're an important part of the ecosystem, right? It may be non-native, maybe an invasive species. Yeah, another non-native species, arguably invasive, is the pillbug, and this one's dead, right? And it's adding to the soil, and we got some probably centipedes. I think there might be millipedes off in the background as well. Here's a false widow that I wanted to show. It's really beautiful living under a rock. Yeah, super pretty. I think this is a Turkmenistan cockroach. I could be wrong about the cockroach species, but there's tons of cockroaches that are living in the black walnut tree there in the food garden. And they're just really fascinating to watch scurry around and hide, but you don't really see them in the daytime, only at night. Here are more of those crustaceans, those pill bugs, and they're decomposers, right? They're decomposing. But then, so it's interesting, they were brought here from Europe, but what came with them was the woodlouse spider too. And the woodlouse spider has these really giant chlysura that it uses to, pierce the skeleton, exoskeleton of that pill bug. Super cool stuff. And here's a native plant that we have, but super cool. You can see there's let's go back. You can see there's a spider in it. I didn't even notice that until tonight, last night that when I was looking at this picture. But I think it's a crab spider, not totally sure. And then there's some Argentine ants that are, probably getting some of that sugar from that plant. But this is a fairy duster. It attracts a ton of hummingbirds. I see it always covered in hummingbirds. And this is the ground, right? And some rabbit poop as well. But you look at the soil and you're just thinking, oh, it's soil, right? Just dirt. But if you look closely, it's covered in seeds. That whole ground is covered in seeds, and a lot of mustard, frankly, is what a lot of those seed capsules are. So nothing is as it appears, right? Things are decomposing, and you get layers of seeds and feces and dead animals, and things just stack on top of each other. Nothing's just dirt. Here's one of the shots I got of the possum, right? And this is a really cool picture because it actually got ants stuck in its nose, and these were Argentine ants, right? So these invasive species have effects on other things, even the size of a possum, and that's affecting its foraging too. But it's also a non-native, potentially invasive species, so that could be an interesting dynamic. But I wanted to end on that note. So yeah, any questions anyone has, I'm more than willing to answer. Yeah, I would guess that's probably tropical. I think we have a few tropical milkweed plants in there, but we have quite an extensive collection of narrowleaf milkweed, which is Asclepias fascicularis, which is really pretty. I really love it. We have some flowering right now in the food garden. I think it's going to die back really soon, but yeah. So Ray asks, sometimes I feel like it's a hard sell to get funder and the general public to care about less charismatic natives. How do you encourage people to care about the less beautiful parts of the ecology, like the picture of the rotten tomato at the start of the webinar, right? And I think just exposure, right? When we have these really candid conversations with the public, where we're talking about spiders, where we're talking about decomposers, we're talking about soil and poop and invasive species. It's not just all doom and gloom. Sometimes it's funny stuff too, and sometimes it's complex science. And what we need to do as science communicators is learn to work within existing communities. I try to collaborate with my partner, right? He's a filmmaker, so him and I are working on a few little mini videos, but he's an artist, right? So as a scientist, I'm trying to collaborate with artists to make educational pieces. So that's one way that I'm trying to communicate with the wider public about things they might not otherwise care about. Things like insectaries, insect farms, or pests on orange trees. Right, most people don't care about, they just want their glass of orange juice in the morning. But do they understand the invasive species that are affecting that orange crop and the communities that are being affected by those pests as well? Not all the time, right? But just being open and talking about things is a great first step, I think. Someone asked another question. Was there anything I found that was surprising? A lot of my work with the bats. You know what was most surprising with the Argentine ants? I knew they were there. I just never thought about Argentine ants all that much. And when I did the night work, it really brought home how severe the Argentine ant problem was. Argentine ants are really bad for native plants. They go straight for the roots for native plants, and they put scale insects on the roots, and they farm those scale insects and aphids and stuff, and they just they're bad, and they go after pollinators. And Argentine ants are a product of colonialism, where they came in the 1800s and through Louisiana and just out and around the United States, and they're all around the world. And the different colonies, I've learned so much about Argentine ants since this project. Like, they're super colonies, right? They don't really, there's a few groups that get in fights with each other, but for the most part, they don't really fight each other. They just like love each other and help each other dominate the world. And Argentine ants are also hurting things like the horned lizard population in the Santa Monica Mountains, because the Argentine ants kill other ant species like the harvester ants, which the horned lizards need for food. And Argentine ants also heavily depend on people, right? So they use a lot of our water resources. But the more that humans spread out into areas where they haven't lived, where urbanization hasn't happened before, these Argentine ants are coming into conflict with other ant species, and we're losing diversity that way. So it really made me think, like, Argentine ants are definitely something. I know a lot of people aren't for like pesticides and stuff, but we got to think of sustainable ways in order to deal with Argentine ants. They're a really bad problem for our crops, for our pollinators, for our native animals. Like, they're a problem for our possums. You like possums? Glad you told me about the Argentine ants. That was something that was really surprising to me. What's my favorite native plant? I like oak trees. I like a lot of native plants. I like oak trees a lot, valley oaks. It's what I study in my research. I like Broughton's milk vetch. I'm always talking about it. It's an endangered pea-related plant that lives in the Santa Monica Mountains and the San Gabriels, and it's a fire follower. I'm really into Broughton's milk vetch. And Santa Susana tarweed is a threatened species of tarweed that we have. It's Dianandra minthornii. It's really pretty and it smells really nice, and it's blooming right now, and I love it. It's a local endemic. Yeah, I don't know. That's an interesting question, Sarah, about are there any impacts of artificial food webs, right? Like the mosquito fish that are non-native, the ducks, which are by and large non-native, except for the mallards, the red-eared sliders, which are an invasive species in many areas and are creating problems for our native Western pond turtle, right? Are those artificial food webs that we're creating, those relationships, are they, I don't know. I've kind of learned to give up on like those sorts of artificial food webs, right? Because they're not real. I don't see them as affecting too many other things. They probably are, and it's just not seen what they're affecting. But it's a pretty contained system that in the Orange Grove, this duck pond. People release their turtles there. Unfortunately, people release their baby ducklings down there. I don't know. I think that it could be a potential vector of disease, but I also think that it gives people a lot of joy to be able to feed ducks, and it gives people a lot of joy to feed turtles. And I think the benefit to the community outweighs the potential risk. I don't think the risk is that significant, unless the turtles were to spread into wild populations, which is possible, but as is, I don't think it's really possible. Yeah, the Argentine ant, the fourth horseman of the apocalypse, totally agree. How do you get rid of Argentine ants? I've heard a lot of success with borax and like ant bait stations that are selective for treating Argentine ants and won't harm things like pollinators and bees and a lot of those insects that you want in your garden. So ant bait stations are pretty good. You want to get something with carbohydrates and with lipids and fats, lipids and proteins. The queens, there's multiple queens per nest, and they eat a protein and fat diet, and the workers, they eat a carbohydrate diet. So if you get a borax solution that's not dangerous to mammals and birds, right? You want it to include kind of both things. So the workers eat it and it slowly kills them. And then they also bring it to the queens who eat it and it slowly kills them. Ecologies and internships. Most internships available to students are unpaid. Can you speak more about what you think would make the field more accessible? Yeah, I think this is a giant problem in ecology. So many, it takes experience to get jobs, right? And then so many of these internships are unpaid, right? I can't tell you how many. I did 3 or 4 unpaid internships, and like, it's really hard work, and it's a costly field. I've had to take out a lot of student loans to do what I do. How can we make it better? We can fund science better. We can vote in politicians that support science. and believe in science, believe in things like climate change, believe in the extinction that we're undergoing right now of so many plants and animals, right? And so if we can better fund science, we can create more scholarship opportunities for students, right? Do your FAFSA. Oh my gosh, do your FAFSA, do your FAFSA. Get student aid, get that free money to help you go to school. Say yes to volunteer opportunities. It's really unfortunate. I wish people could search for opportunities where they're getting paid to do such more. And you should search those out. They're hard to find, and then there's websites like Texas A&M Job Board that does a really great job at hooking up young scientists to opportunities. I don't know why Texas A&M has this stronghold on the jobs board sector for animals and plants, but they do, and it's awesome. Things like, there's USA Jobs has a lot of federal jobs and opportunities that are available on there. Get to know grad students, get to know professors, talk to them about, and then talk to people that are like adjacent to biology, right, in ecology, right? Talk to sustainability people. They're probably interested in this stuff. They just didn't have someone with your expertise to kind of drive projects like this. That's how I'm here. Yeah, I hope that was helpful. How many observations does Csun at home have on INAT? I think we have, I had a slide on there. I think it's like over 200 observations. I could be wrong. I saw a good amount of Broughton's milkvetch at Zuma Canyon. Yeah, there's Malibu Creek State Park, and yeah, has a really good healthy population of Broughton's milkvetch. It really, we became more aware of the population extent after wildfires like the Woolsey fire, but they also eat a lot of that Broughton's. A lot of animals eat Broughton's milkvetch, so whether or not the populations are sustainable, we don't know. There's a lot of habitat fragmentation for Broughton's milkvetch, so it is a species of concern that we need to be aware of and watching and monitoring. And potentially like people growing it in their yards. I know Theodore Payne has started growing Broughton's milkvetch to sell to people. We plant native plants that are rare and endangered into our gardens, and now we're slightly spreading the habitat of that plant, right? You should make sure you're planting plants that are native to your region. But every bit helps. I think that's kind of cool, if not spread awareness. How many are casual versus research grade, and what are the most representative taxa? Yeah, I go through most of the observations and try to bring most of the observations on iNaturalist to research grade. So, I do a lot of monitoring to get casual observations out of the project. So iNaturalist has casual grade observations, and then needs identification, and then research grade. And the research grade observations on iNaturalist are utilized for real science projects and community science. Really cool. But usually research grade observations are looked at by multiple people, and we all agree it's probably this genus, probably this species. So yeah, that's one way that we. And for the project, I'm not quite sure on the numbers. Go check out the Csun at Home project. Get your students involved. If you're a student, staff, or faculty, we want to know what organisms you're seeing around where you live. So please join the project and contribute, and I'll add you. Message me if I don't add you onto the project, and I'll do it. Yeah, I don't know if anyone has any other questions, but I think that's about it.